We're going to see a change in our community composition of bats. There's going to be different bat species that are around. We're going to see fewer bat species that once were common. And that might mean that we see a change in the insect landscape too. We might see more smaller insects that are present because those smaller bats tend to be the ones that are getting hit hardest.
Hey there! Thanks for joining us again for part 2 of our bat episode on the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast. I'm your host, Emmy Reed, ready to share some more batty bat facts with you. If you haven't already checked out part 1, I recommend pausing and listening to that episode first. In part 1, we learned a lot about bat biology, how Dr. Bernard fell in love with these little flying bean bags, and what the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem would look like without bats. I still get stressed thinking about those newborn, tiny baby bats clinging to their moms as they dive bomb all sorts of insects. In part 2, we'll talk about the threats like white nose syndrome and wind farms that spell out trouble for our beloved bats, some myths that Dr. Bernard dispels for us, where to view bats in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and what people can do to support bat populations. All right, here we go with part 2. So, where did white nose syndrome not even start, but why have you seen such a increase over the past 20 so years? Is it climate related? I'm just trying, like, what sort of, either guesses or like pretty strong hypothesis do you have on why it's such a problem now and wasn't 50 years ago?
Yeah, so it is a novel disease to North America. We as in scientists, have been able to track the origin based off of genetics of the fungus itself to Eurasia. So we have found that um, basically bats in, say, Europe and parts of Asia have still get the fungus on them. Some still have disease symptoms, but they're not dying in mass. And so what that means is that those species there have evolved in, time immemorial, I guess, with this pathogen. So we see that the behaviors of bats in these areas is different than our bats in North America. So, as an example, prior to white nose syndrome in the eastern portion of the United States and Canada, you would go do hibernation surveys to count bats. That'd be the one time we can actually get population estimates because we're all kind of in one group. There's a lot of great caves and mines out there. So, for instance, little brown bats used to cluster really tight together. So you'd have 100 bats in a foot by foot square. Like they're just clustered on top. Our gray bats are another species that they start to cluster on top of each other. So you have like layers of bats. It's like a bat ball in the ceiling of the cave. Um, White nose did really well. Transmitting across these species. And what we find is that there are some survivors in these areas that the fungus was first identified in New York. And we're starting to see that they have adapted some sort of behavioral response. So they are now not clustering quite as tightly. Those little brown bats that used to be tight are now kind of saying, hey, can I have my arm room? So basically social distancing, like what we saw in
Oh,
COVID, right?
yeah.
Yeah. And we see that the bats in Europe, at least, are kind of doing the same thing. They're similar species, Myotis, as a genus, but they don't cluster in as big of groups or as tightly as our bats here. So we hypothesize that maybe that is an adaptive response to white nose syndrome. We also know the fungus itself was first identified in Howe's Caverns in New York, which is a tourist cave. And so likely humans brought it over. We don't have bats that cross the oceans. We have them do latitudinal movements, but no longitudinal movements. So likely, my hypothesis is that PD has been introduced multiple times, but for whatever reason, 2006 was the clincher, right? Just like invasive species of plants and things like that. There's something climatically or something that just finally lets this introduction take hold. And so the fungus had never been named to science until we started seeing it killing a bunch of our bats. And we know that it's a novel pathogen because of that outcome, where as soon as 2006, we started seeing piles of dead bats in caves, absence of bats in caves, and that's not happening in the UK or in Europe and Asia. So therefore, they're used to it. It's a novel thing here, and it has taken the bats by storm. And like I said, they're estimating around more than 6 million have died.
Wow, that's pretty bleak.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about the future of it? We talk about they're doing a little social distancing. Hopefully that
Mm-hmm.
can help reduce the spread. Is there any other things that you see the bats are doing or that people are doing that might help curb this devastating disease?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be winners and losers in this, for sure. We're going to lose some species. We're going to in our lifetime, and it has been. God, I guess it's emotionally devastating as a scientist to see your study species just get completely wiped out in your lifetime. I mean, many of us have seen animals go extinct, right? Like we've seen that, and it's been over, a longer time period. This is something that's within. I mean, I'm 39, and I've already seen some extirpations completely from species in areas I used to work in. So I guess the hope is that there are going to be some winners and there's are going to be some survivors. So like I said, in New York and Vermont and some areas that have had white nose syndrome for much longer, there have been 99% declines of our little brown bats, but they're still at 1%. So we're finding that there are some maybe genetic elements of survivors. So there's maybe something that allows for them to be a bit more resistant or tolerant to the disease. We also can see that maybe behaviors along their entire range could allow for more survival. So our little brown bats here in the GYE don't cluster like the bats, like the species does in other parts of their range. So that might be something that allows for them to survive. We see that the Western small-footed myotis, is doing fairly well. So is the Eastern small-footed. So there's something about small feet, I don't know, that or just the species themselves and their behaviors that are doing well. Um, I would say like there are some species that might get the fungus on them, but don't get disease. So like our Townsend big-eared bats, their sister species, the Rafinesky's big-eared, when they engage in torpor, it's for much shorter time periods. And so they arouse at a torpor every few days versus every few weeks. And so that might enable them to not have the fungus take hold, because they're getting up to normal bat body temperature, and that kills off the fungus. And so there will be, we're going to see a change in our community composition of bats. There's going to be different bat species that are around. We're going to see fewer bat species that once were common. And that might mean that we see a change in the insect landscape too. We might see more smaller insects that are present because those
Mhm.
smaller bats tend to be the ones that are getting hit hardest.
I see. Do you see any effects from climate change on Greater Yellowstone bats?
Hmm. Yeah, there's been a couple papers that have come out of Rick Adams' lab that were looking at how climate change can affect reproductive potential in bats. So our bats have one pup a year. Our hoary bats and red bats may have twins on occasion, but for the most part, we have one pup a year. So that's also why we see such decline in our population of bats, is that there's very slow recruitment. So there's like just barely replacement value. So if a bat comes out of hibernation and is of good body condition, most times that female will become pregnant. But if they are unable to access water, which is a limiting resource here in the West, that's going to lead to low milk production, which leads to low survival of those offspring, because they're mammals just like us. So those babies depend on mom to feed them until they're able to fly and forage on their own. So Rick Adams and his crew have found that like that is one of the big potentials, is that as the landscape dries due to climate change, bats are going to have a harder time accessing water or accessing insects near water, and that could lead to poor outcomes. Um, Other things are, our our landscape is on fire right now. I mean, you and I are both talking about how the smoke has definitely been a little bit rough on our throats this morning, and having a landscape that is just not burning in a healthy way, but burning in a hot and out of control way is going to be taking away some habitat from some species. It's making other habitat for others, but if it comes through really fast, those bats might not have an opportunity to recolonate because it's just kind of a desolate landscape. So yeah, climate change is going to affect our wildlife in many ways, in many different ways. One other thing that they're starting to find are that folks that work in caves, like actually study the caves. I work in caves, but for bats. Um, they're finding that as the climate warms, it's also changing the temperature and humidity in caves. And so that could change that habitat to maybe be less conducive for bats for winter or for maternity roosts. So it's, yeah, climate change is not great. It's not going to do well for animals.
Yeah,
So,
two thumbs down all
yeah,
around.
yeah,
Like,
boo, zero on the
boo.
Rotten Tomatoes score.
Seriously. Um, could you tell us a bit about some of the research you're currently conducting? Do you have any interesting or unique finds that you can share with us?
Oh gosh, yeah. So my lab is doing a lot of really cool research in and around Wyoming, South Dakota, and we're going to start having some projects in Montana. So the first one, kind of tying into community compositional change due to white nose syndrome. My PhD student Renee Lyle, she has been working in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and her project initially was to capture and track northern long-eared bats to help the National Park Service know what kind of habitat and roosts to protect for that species, because that is a species that is now endangered due to white nose syndrome. Um, the first season she was there, she captured 3, so not great. There used to be dozens, at least in previous research, and she has captured 0 since then. So her project pivoted to kind of now get at how are we seeing this change in the community composition, and those bats that are surviving, how are they faring? Are we seeing maybe dietary shifts, kind of like you and I chatted about earlier? We're like, if there's less competition, is there more food for these bats? We're also looking at the parasites on these individuals as well, to see like if they're getting hit by this one side punch of white nose syndrome, are they getting hit by this other punch that has to do with parasites? So like, are they just like poor body condition? The cool thing about her work too is that she's not just capturing, she is putting out echolocation devices, or basically these bat detectors is what we call them. And we talked about how cool echolocation is, but as scientists, we can actually listen for bats in a landscape and be able to identify what species are present and kind of get a relative activity level from that. And so she's having these detectors out in the landscape at all the places that she's captured to try to see, are these bats completely absent, or are they just not being captured when she has her nets up? And she's finding some pretty I guess, sad results. The species that were once very common are no longer present for the most part. She's seeing decline in those white nose syndrome susceptible species, and she's also seeing declines in our hoary bats, which is something that is likely attributed to wind energy development. There are species that might be listed. They're petitioned for listing and on the 2028 docket for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And wind power is one of the ones that is a likely culprit, because they do get hit pretty hard with new wind energy developments. So hers is a bit doom and gloom, but it's the managers in the National Park Service, those biologists, are really eager to find out what she's learning. My student Julia is working on the Townsend's big-eared bat. So just like that picture that you have in your house, she's working with them and trying to investigate, how does climate change or habitat change alter their behaviors and use of these sites. So they're kind of a cave obligate species. They are found in houses or some structures in mines every once in a while, but they tend to really like being in caves and rocks. And she's in her first full year. And so she's doing research in the Shirley Basin, in the Bighorns, and then in eastern Wyoming out by Guernsey. And she's been finding some really fascinating movements. And it was up at the Bighorns in the Tongue River area. She was finding that bats captured at Tongue River, which is a maternity site, have numerous secondary roosts that are not caves, but they're actually rock crevices. And that's kind of the first that we've documented anything like that here in the States. So she's finding some pretty interesting movement. The sad thing is that that whole area just got burnt up in the elk fire. So so we're eager to, when we are allowed to get up there, when the Forest Service and folks say that it's safe for us to go, we're going to have to assess to see if our equipment is okay, or if we need to replace it. But what will be interesting, I guess, to see kind of a flower through the thorns type of situation is how did the bats fare and how do their behaviors or activity and use of the habitat around these sites after the burn changed. So that's one thing that we're kind of interested in seeing. The other project that I had a graduate student work on, Logan Detweiler. He just graduated last year. He was working on bats and bridges. So this is kind of a cool project. And there has been a couple surveys that happened in the 90s in the GYE saying that, yep, bats use bridges. And there was an incident in the GYE where they found that a hoary bat had been using a bridge, which is very rare. So there's like a little note that's out there that's saying like, yep, this has been documented. But Logan went through all of Wyoming and surveyed bridges that were owned and operated by YDOT, or I should say maintained by YDOT, and found that 75% of the 500 bridges he surveyed were used by bats. And of those, he had guano that was collected from about 325, and little brown bats use all of them. So we are now trying to see about getting some funding to continue this research to try to get at, you know, other, like, when do bats use these bridges, as far as like when do they arrive and when do they leave? Because, for those of you who have been to the GYE know that our construction season, our summer season, is very short. And so there's a very small window of opportunity for improvements on roads to occur. And that does happen to be when bats are active on the landscape. So we want to get at more of that timing and what species truly are using these roosts so that we can help YDOT be able to do work to make sure our roads are safe, but also minimize any declines or disturbance to these bats. Because as you're hearing, right, there's a lot of things that could lead to our declines of our once common species.
Fascinating. Is it possible to track bats using tiny little GPS collars or backpacks, or do you guys rely primarily on those nets that you can hang up and catch the bats for surveys?
Yeah, our bats, the species that we have here, are small. So we don't have any GPS transmitters that are capable of staying on long term. There have been some folks out of California and Colorado that have been able to suture GPS transmitters on hoary bats, but that does require a lot of know how and expertise. But because of the morphology of bats, right, their wings are their hands, but then their pinky bone is attached to their ankle from this big thing of like area of skin. And so backpacks don't work, unlike on birds where you can easily kind of move around feathers and be able to put those on. So our bats are tracked by very high frequency or VHF transmitters. So those are the ones that just ping every few seconds. And they last, the size of them for our bats within that 5 to 10% body size. They last anywhere from like 7 to 21 days, depending on how big you can get them. And we just have to glue them on. So we kind of shave a little bit of the back, like, which, is like horror of anyone who falls asleep, at a party and wakes up with like part of their hair shaved. But that's like what bats are getting. So like we shave a little bit right in between their shoulder blades, and then using surgical glue, we put this transmitter on there, and then we try to find the bats based off those pings. Some of our bats are easier to find than others. Some use trees, some use caves. We can kind of find them a bit better. However, what my students are finding out is that most of our bats tend to use rocks, and it's very hard to track bats to rocks because the typical MO is that you kind of start where you captured them. So at the capture site, that's where you're starting to listen. Well, these bats could be going like just hightailed out of there. And so unless you have a direct line of sight to this rock roost, you're often not going to be able to find them very quickly. But they're starting to figure it out. And like Julia's done really good with tracking her Townsends. She had some success, a lot more success this season than she did last spring and fall when we just couldn't find them because they just go.
You mentioned one kind of popular misconception about bats earlier is that bats are completely blind. But are there any other ones that you see kind of make their way on the internet or through, just kind of general communication that you'd like to either dispel or at least just shed some light on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, bats aren't blind. We talked about that. They don't want to fly into your hair. They're curious. So, if you have maybe some bugs around you, or I don't know, there's some interesting sound that's coming out from near you, they're going to come down towards you to figure out what's going on because to them it might sound like an insect or something that they're curious about. So, when they kind of swoop down towards you, that's why don't want to harm you whatsoever. They want to avoid you just like you want to avoid them. Um, One of the other like really detrimental ones to bats, those detrimental myths are that all bats have rabies, and they don't. So if you look at the population of bats, free flying bats, so those that are just going about their business, say in the GYE, it's like 0.25% to 1% of those bats have rabies. So a very, very minuscule percentage. Bats that are found in buildings or houses or human structures, they are the ones that might be juveniles who are just kind of getting themselves in trouble, or a quick hide because a storm came through, or maybe there is something going on with them. Those tend to be submitted for rabies testing. And so in Wyoming, we have bats that are submitted because of getting in trouble like that, or being found in houses or brought in by cats and dogs. And of those in the last 5 years or so, it's been around 2 to 7% of those who have been in a structure or downed by an animal that have been positive. So really, like, it's not, they can get rabies just like any other animal, but they are not all rabid. It's actually very few. And when we're capturing on the landscape, I mean, all of my students and technicians and I, like, we're all rabies vaccinated to help prevent any opportunity for that transmission to occur. If a bat that we capture is acting odd or strange or can't take off, we kind of watch it a little bit more closely. But in all the years that I've captured bats, only one of them has been rabid, and that was a recent one. So we made sure we alerted the health department and the state to make sure that, like, just because it was near some folks' house, and we want to make sure that those people were okay. But yeah, so just like, I think the other thing is oftentimes bats get in trouble because they're small and cute, right? Like, little kids know not to touch a skunk and a fox or a raccoon, right? You know better than to touch a wild animal. However, bats look like little fluffy hacky sacks. So they look like they are touchable and squeezable and lovable. And to some they are, but if you see a downed bat, don't touch it. Or if you need to move it so that kids or pets don't get a hold of it, thick gloves, don't touch it. Use a box like you would a spider kind of thing to not touch the spider, and just move that out of the way, or call local game and fish or a warden, because that's going to be the best thing to do. And the thing that I can say, as far as like, if you wake up and there was a bat in your room and you don't know if there was an exposure, definitely call your doctor and follow the CDC guidance just to be safe. Because rabies is definitely a fatal disease, so you don't want to even play with that. But the biggest misconception is that all bats are rabid, and they definitely are not. Very few.
All right, good to know. Best to be safe, but we don't need to worry so needlessly if we
Right.
come nearby a bat. Okay, good to know. Um, are there any spots in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem that are optimal for viewing our bats? I I doubt we have anything like the Congress Bridge in Austin, Texas, which, if our listeners don't know what that is, it's this really large bridge that people can go and watch. I'm exaggerating here, like a billion bats fly out during certain seasons, and it's something that has always seemed really cool to me. But where can we go in our ecosystem where maybe we can catch some of these little guys in action?
Yeah, I mean, you're not far off as far as with the number of bats coming from the Congress Avenue Bridge. It is millions. It's like at least a million, um, which we don't have anything like that in Wyoming or the GYE. So we don't have a million bats. We might have a couple hundred that are coming from one site. There's been some really great work by Joe Johnson, who has found little browns using buildings, the old buildings in Yellowstone. There's also some folks that are working on light pollution and bats in Teton. So sometimes you can just see them by looking at or around lights because that's where insects are. Therefore, the bats will be there. But I would say the best place to see them is going to be at bodies of water. So, like Yellowstone Lake or Jenny Lake or any rivers that have nice corridors, because like I said earlier, right, the water is a limiting resource in the West. And so bats need water, their insects need water. And so what's going to draw them to the buffet line? That water source. So going out at night and checking out, looking up during, at night to see where those bats are, it's going to be at those bodies of water. I have some species that we've captured on acoustic detectors here around my house in Casper. They're hoary bats, but you'll see a lot more like in Casper on the North Platte. So that tends to be the best place. So yeah, in the GYE, go to the rivers and the lakes and you'll find some bats.
Got it. And you mentioned nighttime. Do you find it's better at dusk, at 1 a.m. where it's really, really dark, right before sunrise? Do you find any difference in those times?
Yeah, right around dusk, it tends to be the best. So if you can imagine, a bat has been sleeping its little heart out, all day long. And so, what do you do when you wake up first thing in the morning, right? You get coffee and you eat breakfast. And so that's what a bat's dusk is. They are waking up and they are going to go get food. And so you're most likely to see bats at that time. You will still see bats throughout the night, but the peak activity tends to be right when sun sets and those insects are still really active before it gets too cool.
Okay, Riley, we have a few listener questions. If that's all right, we'll get into those now. So we have Rob from Washington asks, do bats migrate in and out of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? What do they do all winter? And so I know you touched on this a bit in some of our earlier questions, but maybe you could talk a bit about what their pathway looks like, maybe, where they are seasonally, maybe just a little bit more diving into their migratory patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rob. We have at least two species that are truly migratory to the GYE. So that's the silver haired bat and the hoary bat. And I would like to say that we know everything about their movements like we do birds, but we don't. So unfortunately, there's lots of mystery with bats, and some of it is because we don't have GPS transmitters that are small enough. So we actually don't know truly the migratory pathways of these species. We assume, based off of basic bat ecology and behavior, that as these bats are moving into these various landscapes, they're probably following the topography a bit. They're in corridors, they're in trees. We do know that our hoary bats are, like I said earlier, very susceptible to mortality at wind farms. And some of that is because, like I said earlier, hoary bats, because they're open air flyers, they're not echolocating a ton, right? So it's just like if you get up in the middle of the night, you're not going to turn on all the lights to go to the bathroom, right? You kind of know your way. You know exactly every turn and possible toe breaker. and you can make it back and forth pretty easily. If you buy a table and put it in your hallway, what happens when you first start getting up before you have like reprogrammed your brain on that pathway? You run into it, right? Or you hit it or whatever. So what we're assuming or hypothesizing is that hoary bats will go south one time, and then all of a sudden they'll come back north, and there's this huge wind farm, and bam, they get hit. And it's usually not necessarily direct collisions, but barotrauma, which is essentially this fast change in the pressure around a wind turbine, and it essentially liquefies the bat on the inside. So the bat looks fine on the outside, but is absolutely destroyed and dies. And our migratory bats are getting hurt the worst from that. There's also some thoughts that the coloration on, or like the color or the shininess of the paint on these turbines might look like water when they echolocate, and so they go down, and that could be when they get hurt. There's also lots of insects that hang out around the base of these turbines, and therefore that could be what's drawing these bats in. So there's a couple ways that we are hypothesizing that bats are getting hurt. So in that migratory pathway, we're seeing that there's barriers. So we might be losing bats in the GYE because of that. Our bats that don't migrate tend to have kind of short distance movements between their seasonal roosts, so those maternity bachelor roosts, and then those hibernation sites or hibernacula. And in the GYE, that's going to be anything from mines and true caves to cracks and crevices and rocks. And our bats will fatten up during swarming, which is also when they mate, and in the fall, and then they'll go into hibernation. And if everything's good, they'll come out of hibernation, and the female overwinters that sperm and then becomes pregnant. So that's a cool little fun fact. So that's what those bats are doing during the wintertime if they don't migrate, is that they mate, hibernate, and then they have babies and kind of disperse on the landscape again. But I would say of the species, that the 13 species that tend to be found in the GYA, 2 migrate long distances. The others kind of move around a bit. We don't know a lot about the pallid bats. We don't know a lot about the spotted bats that are in that area. So we don't really know what they do necessarily. Yeah, so that's another area of inquiry. But yeah.
Oh, geez. Well, I got to insert my own listener question. Is there any way to deter bats from these wind farms that doesn't, eventually like hurt them, I guess, the same in the long term? I'm like, gosh.
Yeah. There's been a lot of great research from folks at Bat Conservation International and Aaron Beerwald and colleagues up in Canada that have been trying to figure out, what helps bats. And first and foremost, what helps bats is what's called curtailment. So we know that bats primarily fly during certain wind speeds, but there's kind of a threshold, an upper threshold that they just aren't going to be flying. Their prey isn't out, and it's too dangerous for them. So if there's a way to stop the wind turbines from turning until that upper threshold for bats, you'll save loads of bats and you'll save loads of birds. That tends to be an option that is less desirable by many power companies, which I suppose makes sense because money is involved, right? So you make money at those low wind speeds. So a lot of really cool folks are in Texas and Idaho are working on trying to figure out how best to deter bats. And so, like I said, bats are really curious. They also can hear other echolocation calls, and there might be a way to have species-specific callbacks that don't attract the bats, but then kind of somehow say, get out of here, don't come near. And so that might prevent bats from getting too close to these rotating propellers. And so there's some of that's being worked on elsewhere. There's also some people who are trying to see if they can create almost like this force field, like this laser that can detect bats. They can do it with bigger bodied birds. And so there's some folks that are working on that out in some power wind farms out north of Casper for like bald eagles and golden eagles. Bats are really tiny. So they're trying to perfect that to be able to also have it where like, okay, we have a large group of bats coming through. Let's like quickly shut down those propellers and then let them pass. There's also research that's looking on what is the timing with which the most bats are harmed. And so if there's like a pulse of activity between, say April and June, is that a period where they're a little bit more vigilant and maybe shut down some of that wind power generation during that period? And then maybe July to August is better. Folks are trying to figure that out as well. So there's a lot of different options. We know the primary answer is to just stop with the rotation of the blades until a certain period or a certain type of wind, or knots, I think is how it's measured. But we're coming with alternative methods because we do want to minimize climate change. Therefore, things like solar and wind are important. However, there are costs to both of those options as well.
Wow, yeah, that I'm glad that that's being worked on because the effect those wind farms must have on bats is very distressing. So I'm glad that there's some stuff in the works. Our next question is Holly from Indiana asks, "How can you attract bats to your yard to have them deal with mosquitoes?"
Oh, that's a good question and a common question because everyone loves to hate mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are an easily reviled species of insect, or group of insects. So yeah, I mean, first and foremost, having good vegetation and trees around can attract bats. Some people have ponds, and that's going to attract bats because, right, like I said before, that water is going to be a resource for insects. Therefore, you have bats. You can plant bat-friendly gardens, usually native plants that attract the insects that bats will eat, and that will be something. Depending on where you live, I mean, if you're further south, you can also plant night flowering plants, and that'll bring those pollinator bats in as well. Bat boxes are often something that people will put up to encourage bats to roost. There are certain types of bat boxes that are better than others. So the ones that we often see in our stores in and around the GYE tend to be single chambered bat boxes. Those are not preferred. If you can get a multi-chambered bat box or a rocket box, that is even better. And there's some really good resources online through Bat Conservation International that have those schematics if you want to build it or where to order it. I would also say, reducing pesticide use. I know we want to not have our mosquitoes, but other insects are beneficial. And so bats will eat those. And by just having bats present, like even if the bats aren't directly eating those mosquitoes, again, that landscape of fear is going to keep the mosquitoes away. The final thing that I can think of is to try to make sure that, say, like cats are really good at killing bats. And so if we can keep cats indoors or supervised outside time or in a catio, that is awesome because then they're not going to get hurt themselves. They won't hurt little critters, including little snakes and skinks and salamanders and frogs and mice, as well as no bats. So that's those are kind of the main things to either make sure bats are around or to make sure bats survive when they do visit your yard.
Perfect. And we'll put the link to information about the boxes in the show notes. So anyone can take a look at that and see if it fits in their yard. Um, for our listeners who live in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and beyond, what can we do to support bat populations?
Oh, I think one of the biggest things is be a bat advocate. So, you've learned a lot today, I hope. At least the take home is that bats aren't scary. They're very cool and useful for the ecosystem. And so being a bat advocate is going to be huge. So just knowing that if you hear family, friends have negative perceptions of bats, try to like stop that to try to tell them that they are good to have around, right? They're just as good in a functioning ecosystem as pronghorn mule deer and elk are, right? So they're just not seen as much. I think if folks are wanting to increase habitat, having old like snags in their yard, they have enough land that they can have some snags around. That'll bolster some habitat. Doing some of the things that I suggested from the listener question. And there's also ways to donate to causes. So like if you are of the capacity to have a charitable donation, there's numerous bat foundations that will gladly accept some funds. There's also rehabbers throughout the US and Canada that will take donations to help rehab bats that have maybe gotten themselves in trouble. This end of this month is Bat Week. It's Bat Month, really, but it's Bat Week, the 26th through the 31st, I believe. And so, engaging in some local bat activities at your national parks and whatnot can also be great too. But I think the biggest thing is just recognizing and appreciating bats for what they are and how beneficial they are to us and our ecosystem.
Perfect. Plenty of ways to be an advocate for bats. We've covered a lot today, but is there any just really cool or interesting, unique fact about bats that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, man. Let's see. Well, I think one thing that I kind of touched on, I think in Rob's question, was that bats mate in the fall and have babies in the spring. So I think that is a lot of mammals will have different ways of kind of pausing implantation or fertilization. So there's like kind of three foundational ways. But bats, at least most of our temperate North American bats, mate in the fall, and the females will select somehow. We don't. There's a lot of research out there that's working on it, but we truly do not know how this happens. But they will be able to keep sperm alive all winter long. And then if they come out of hibernation and are good body condition, so they were able to maintain enough fat, they're able to migrate to their seasonal roosts, then they will let sperm meet egg and become pregnant. But they're keeping sperm alive for sometimes 9 months, if not longer. And we have no idea why. So there are some mating events that occur in the cave. There might be some mating events that might occur in the spring, but the most of those bats engage in swarming, which is that hanging out, meeting each other and mating, and then have babies way later in the spring. And so females are pregnant for about I think our insectivorous ones are 4 to 6 weeks or so. Whereas I was doing a little research and found that vampire bats can be pregnant for up to 7 months. I think the other cool thing that, is, I guess, to get back to the myths, but what's also really fascinating is that there's only 3 species of vampire bat globally. So we have 1,500 or so. About 1,480, I think, is the most recent number of bat species globally. And 3 of those species are vampire bats. And they all live in Mexico and kind of further south. And what's really fascinating is that, at least for our Desmodus rotundus, which is our common vampire bat, they like mammals and they can run very well, because what happens is that they fly down and then they will slowly crawl their way towards their, a cow, or, well, cows now, but it used to be other, non-farm animals back in the day. And they have these thermoregulatory sensors on their nose and can find where the best place to bite is. And then they'll bite their prey. And the saliva in these bats have anticoagulant and antiseptic properties. And so it just allows the blood to flow without hurting the animal. And then they don't suck blood, they drink the blood. So they'll drink the blood up. And those chemical properties have been very useful in developing heart medication for humans. So medication that's based off of vampire bat saliva is better than anything synthetic that's come up in the lab. So vampire bats, despite them maybe being a little scary, are very useful for human health and survival.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah,
Just bats, they're doing it all for us.
they are. They're pollinators. They're heart savers. They
They
are cute
are.
and
They
not
are
cuddly, but they are cute.
cute from a distance, absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
Riley, a question that we ask everyone who comes on our podcast is, who is your conservation hero?
That is such a great question. And I think I mean, I feel like my conservation hero has like changed over time, right? As I've grown as a scientist. But I would say right now, my conservation hero is going to be my PhD advisor, Dr. Gary McCracken. He had been doing science at the University of Tennessee since like 1979. He recently just retired. And he has done so much for the world of bats, whether it is filling in information gaps, to better understanding how they echolocate, to knowing how baby bats, Brazilian free-tailed bats, find their mothers in a cave of 30 million individuals, to just finding out how fast bats fly. And as a budding bat biologist, I used to read all his papers and get really, like just excited about the cool stuff he was doing. And then I got to meet him at my first North American Society for Bat Research conference. And he's so kind, so wonderful, and just a great mentor. And he has taught me how to be a scientist, a ethical and good scientist, ask questions, testable hypotheses, and ultimately how to try to do things that are beneficial for bats. And one funny little story that I have of Gary is that he wanted to come out with me once to one of my field sites during my PhD. And I was so excited because he's like, he's really busy. He was department head at the time, and he hiked out with me to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And I realized as we get there, this is like a 3-mile hike in, I did not remember the key to the stashed ladder. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. Gary's going to be so mad. And he was like, just hop on my shoulders. So I literally stood on the shoulders of this bat biologist giant trying to access my bat detector. And I wish I had the forethought to set up a camera to catch that, because it's only in my mind. But Gary has done, he's done so much. He's awesome. And he has advised and mentored hundreds of us. And so our family tree, our academic family tree, is very broad and beautiful. And I'm just very thankful to have been in his lab when he was still at the University of Tennessee.
I love that. And I love that all he's done for bats and can serve as hopefully a continued inspiration to everyone to, hey, we got to learn more about these guys. We got to help conserve them and, just elevate them in the space. I want to say thank you so much to you for coming on the podcast. This has been such a treat for me to learn all about bats, both in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and beyond. And also just thank you for all the incredible work you're doing.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a great treat. So I appreciate it.
I want to spend another moment thanking Dr. Riley Bernard for joining the podcast to celebrate these wonderful flying marvels. How lucky we are to have you studying and advocating for bats. To learn more about Dr. Bernard's work, I've placed information about her lab at the University of Wyoming in the show notes. You'll also find some links about building bat homes and more. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If you'd like to learn more about our work and stay in touch for opportunities to take action, now's the time to do it. For a limited time, if you join our online community via the link in our show notes, we'll mail you both a Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast sticker and a Greater Yellowstone Coalition sticker to adorn your water bottle, laptop, or wherever else you want to show your support. This opportunity will run from November 1st, 2024 to February 28th, 2025, so make sure to sign up between those dates to get your free stickers. Thank you for loving this remarkable landscape that we all want to stay remarkable for years to come. As always, thank you for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.